People want to save animals and so on, and protect people, and they are generous. So they will give money to this kind of consideration, thinking that they're doing really something good for the animals, but in reality, they're doing something good for the salaries or the activities of those, such as PETA. What they do a campaign, they raise money for that campaign, for another campaign, and so on. They go from campaign to the other one without, again, achieving nothing.
Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. I'm your host, Alex Newman, senior editor at the New American Magazine. We have a very special guest joining us today. He's got an incredible resume. We could spend 20 minutes talking about it. We won't. I'll give you some of the highlights. At the 1963 promotion of the Laval University Law Faculty in Quebec, he was selected to become life president. This promotion is actually famous in Canada for having delivered a prime minister, a premier of Quebec, 9 judges, 5 senators, a speaker of the House, ambassador, members of parliament. And so in this capacity as life president, Eugène Lapointe gathers them every year. He also joined the secretariat of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species in 1982 until 1990. That's in Lausanne, Switzerland. There he served as the Secretary General of the Convention, and he also founded the IWMC World Conservation Trust in 1994. Just recently, he was actually given the Order of the Rising Sun of Japan by the Emperor of Japan for his efforts on conservation. So he is one of the world's leading conservationists. He's been involved in this for many, many decades. In fact, since before I was born. And so his credentials to speak on this are flawless. I mean, there's probably not many people in the world with this kind of credentials. And yet he has expressed some concerns about what's happening with conservation. Eugène, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I want to start with just with some basics. You're a big advocate of conserving nature, conserving resources, conserving biodiversity. Why do you think it's important for the world to work on those things?
I think, thanks for inviting me first. I think my interest started really during my childhood, because I was raised in a forest. Never went to school until the age of 12. My mother was my teacher. And my relation with nature at that time was so important, because I was hunting and fishing as of the age of 7 to feed the family while my father was patrolling or gone somewhere. And at that time, I could realize that the importance of protecting, conserving the resource for the benefit of my family and myself was important for me. And this has been the driver behind my conservation efforts all of my life. And right now I am a conservationist, but I want to conserve wild species for the benefit of human beings, and not strictly for the benefit of the species, which is the agenda of most of those involved with animal rights and so on.
Yeah, and so I want to drill down on this animal rights issue. You have publicly expressed some concerns and disagreements with the animal rights movement. Talk a little bit about where you differ and why you think they're coming at this from the wrong angle.
I don't think there's a difference in terms of the importance we must give to animals. They have rights, also like plants have rights and so on. Every living creature does have a certain number of rights. But where I am against, and when you're trying to invade human rights by creating more and more rights for animals. And this is what's happening with the philosophy animals rights at the moment, is the extremism that has been developed by this mantra, which is at the moment. And the point is that you don't go anywhere with that, because more you distance people from their possible of access or their possible of utilization of the resources, more you create enemies of nature, enemies of the wild resources. And they have been developing with the public and with the media up to a certain sense, mantras such as animal lives matter. Here they copied what happened in the US. Or again, as every life counts. And if you look at that, it's against the fundamental law of nature, because we forget that in the concept of life, you have the notion of death. You cannot live without having death. The fundamental law of nature says that a species must die, a specimen of a species must die to ensure the survival of another living specimen, and sometimes even for its own species. So it's with those kind of misinformation, misjudgment on what is this relationship between human beings and animals that I really have strong objections to the orientation given by the extremists of the philosophy of the propaganda, I would say, of animal rights.
So let's talk about that a little more. Like, we have a very prominent organization that's pretty active in the United States called PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And they argue that, we shouldn't have livestock. People should not have pets. I mean, I think that's very obviously extreme. I think to regular people who eat chicken, who eat steak, things like this.
I call them wackos.
Okay, very good. But you're going even beyond that and saying that the people who are arguing about conserving animals just for the sake of the animal, they're kind of missing the point, right? They're missing the human element of why these should be concerned. Why do you think they're doing that? Is it just out of a sense of are they just misguided, or is there some kind of agenda that they're pursuing that isn't in line with what we should be doing?
Two aspects: money and publicity, both being closely related. If they, through the publicity, they can say, see, we've saved the elephants, or we've saved the tigers, or we've saved this. In reality, they've saved nothing. They're just to make a stunt of somewhere, or like Greenpeace does also quite often, not at the same level, but and then they say, you see, people, what we do, we're fighting to save the animals and the plants sometimes. But in reality, they are not saving anything. But there is, unfortunately, they table on the generosity of people. People want to save life. People want to save animals and so on, and protect people. And they are generous. So they will give money to this kind of consideration, thinking that they're doing really something good for the animals. But in reality, they're doing something good for the salaries or the activities of those, such as PETA. And what they do a campaign. They raise money for that campaign, for another campaign, and so on. They go from campaign to the other one without, again, achieving nothing for the conservation.
And you think there's a risk then that some of these more extreme efforts will actually turn the general public against even the idea of conservation and things like this, huh?
Absolutely. This is one that the word conservation has been transvestite, has been manipulated, has been contaminated so many occasions. Like, you have another extreme, the sea shepherd, fighting to save the whales and the fish and so on all over the world, being a parrot, in fact. And they claim this is the sea shepherd conservation. They call themselves conservationists. You have the extreme of the other side of the extreme, poacher, who call themselves at times conservationists. And, it's very difficult at times for people because of, again, the activities of the media, because we keep in mind that quite often the media have the same interest, I should say, in developing the agenda of the extreme animal rights, because they can sell more copies. I don't know too many journalists which will say, well, listen, we have a hunting community in Botswana really help the people to live, to develop programs and so on for the local and rural communities. But see, what's happening is that we do that because we can allow people to use the wildlife. Not a journalist will be interested in publishing that. But if you say, poachers are killing the elephants in Africa, and it's awful, show a picture of a dead elephant, and then, of course, journalists will publish that. And this is where we have a real problem in trying to convince the people of the danger of this many interpretations given to the word conservation. What does it mean in reality?
That's fascinating. Folks, we're going to go to a quick break. And when we get back on the other side, we're going to talk some on the quote unquote rights of nature, rights of rivers, which have come to the fore lately. Also, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So stay with us. We're going to be right back.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
The truth is hard to find, but the New American has it. Check it out at thenewamerican.com.
Eugene, before we went to break, we were talking about animal rights and things. I want to shift gears a little bit now because there's been a new trend. I've seen in New Zealand, for example, they've christened a river. They've said the river now has human rights. They're saying in some cases, trees and nature. And you mentioned earlier, you think plants have rights. What do you think of this idea of rivers having rights or even having human rights? Is there a danger to that? What are your views on this subject?
I start by saying this is stupid. This is the best description I can have of this. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the New Zealander, it's not the first time that they go completely off reasonable approach in terms of being able to either discuss conservation of species or relationship human being and species. But in the case of the river, of course, if I understand correctly, the Maoris, whom I met in New Zealand, I respect greatly. They're fantastic people. And they respect the river. They give a certain credit of being able to cure certain disease and so on. They respect, they give almost the side of divinity, of godness to the river. And at the same time, it goes along the line of many previous, like the Egyptians, an example, the Incas, do they have for tools, for rocks, for certain trees, a character of divinity and an important religious and cultural value. But for a government to come out and say, okay, but this river is like a human being, first of all, you just can't do that. If you give status of human being to a river, it means that maybe I can marry a river if at some point, and why not? If you have to be selective. So if you are selective, you cannot give the status of human being. The same thing a few years ago, I think it was not that far away from there, a colony of gorillas was granted, I think it was Australia, if I'm not mistaken, the status of human being. Again, where do you start and you stop in that status? Because that means, again, I would have been able to marry a gorilla. If it's a full human being, why not? If you push the extent of what I call ridiculous decision by the government to the maximum, well, you have to look at those possibilities. And it does make sense to say that, but also it doesn't make sense to say it because it does make sense simply to grant human being status to a river or a tree or a wild animal.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were shocked by that, including conservationists. It was very bizarre, but there does seem to be a movement around the world to move forward with this kind of thing. I want to ask you about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030. There's stuff in there about biodiversity and also consumption and production and the sustainable management of forests and things. What are your thoughts overall on Agenda 2030? I know it's gotten a lot of criticism, especially in the United States. I'm not sure about Canada, but there's been quite a bit of criticism for different ideas that are in there. But what are your overall thoughts on Agenda 2030 as a mechanism for conservation, for preserving the planet?
Well, maybe I should start by setting up the last 3 months of last year, 2022, you had four important international meetings, governmental international meetings. First, you had the International Whaling Commission in October, followed by in November, the CITES meeting, the International Convention in International Trade of Endangered Species. And then you had the Biodiversity Convention. And then you had the climate change agenda.
Yep, I was there.
And if you look at all those four, there was something in common, is that what I would call the total denial of human rights. Whatever you're talking about, people, traditional people don't even have the right to hunt abundant species of whales because you don't kill whales. And then you go to CITES. It was the same thing with sharks. Abundant species of sharks was removed away from artisanal fisheries close to the shore and so on, people fishing with small little boat, and for which the blue shark, as an example, is a very important source of income and food. And then you move to biodiversity with 30-30 and what could call even to about the agenda, climate warming agenda. But you're talking mainly about 30-30, and I think it's political dream, if you want. Again, promoted by the same kind of people who want to keep human being away from wild species. The objective is so-called to protect life on Earth by taking 30% of the land and 30% of the waters outside of human activity. How can you achieve that? When so many nations, I don't know, the great majority of the nations are fishing nations, and how can you deprive them from this crucial source of income, and of course, a source of subsistence, livelihood, and food security? My dream and all of that is that they will never be able to achieve it, hopefully, because it's like the ICA that we had before, which has been a total failure. And it's just a political dream. All of those head of states came in there, briefed by the different NGOs and so on, and came and said, oh, we did something good to save the planet. And when I look at the paper, I challenged one of the newspaper here, and they said, the head of state have entered into an agreement, a historical agreement, to save life on Earth by prohibiting people to kill and so on. Well, that means that, in fact, they are accelerating. If you don't kill, you don't live. This is another fundamental law of nature. And this is what those four global international meetings have done together, which I hope will never achieve a result, because it will be at the detriment of indigenous people, the detriment of the hundreds of millions of people living with fisheries.
We're almost out of time, Eugène. I want to ask you just kind of like a big picture question. There's been a debate that's been going on for a long time about the best way to protect resources, to protect the environment, to protect nature. And there's a school of thought that holds that strong protections for private property rights is one way to conserve resources, protect nature. We have this debate periodically out west in the western states where do private forest managers do a better job than government control over the land? Does enforcement of private property rights do a better job of protecting the river than, say, government regulation? How do you see that? Do you see private property rights as a mechanism for this, or should
Absolutely.
the government lead the way?
Absolutely. The property right has proven its success, I think, in many occasions. If I look as an example at the vicuña in the Andes, which is this very special smaller animal producing the finest wool in the world. And they were at the decline, almost gone by the 60s and so on, until the a famous conservationist, Benavides, came into there and decided to give to the peasant, to those living with the vicuña, the right to exploit them, and not only even they're given the property rights to those animals, sharing the land with them. Now the species are flourishing in 7 of the countries where you have vicuña population in the Andes. And you can see the same thing of when the Southern African countries have without interference from the international community, but they have the property rights of their elephants and their wild animals. They could, with the product, increase the population of their wild animals, their elephants, where other countries are having total prohibitions and so on, could not do anything but to see their population being declined by poaching activities, because that's another factor that the animal rights are proposing protectionism, prohibitions, and we all know with human beings what prohibitions can do. We've seen the example with alcohol, with gambling, with smoking, and so on. So this is certainly not the best way. So I'm getting away from your question.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, Eugene. What's the best way for people to follow your work? Where can they find you on the internet? Are you on social media people can follow the work that you're doing?
Yes, we have. We're also contributing a bit in the social media. There's, of course, we have our website, IWMC.org. And soon, I would suspect within the next 6 weeks, I should come out with the second edition of my book, Wildlife Betrayed, where I do express in great length the various problems associated with the extremism that we're putting into conservation of nature. And I address one specific issue, is that the extremism comes from European countries and from United States countries, so North America, let's say. And it's amazing to realize that those countries will become rich, wealthy, and developed because they've been able to use their resources. At that time, there was no USAID or Canadian CITES or any other development program to help them in terms of achieving development. And now they're telling the poor country, don't touch your resources. Instead, we give you money, which is, I think, dehumanizing people. And I think with this kind of attitude. So anyway, I got my book, Wildlife Betrayed, should come out soon. And hopefully within the next, taking into account those 4 recent decisions by the international community that we just spoke about.
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to read it, Eugene. Thank you so much for joining us today. Folks, that was Eugène Lapointe, conservationist extraordinaire. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter. Until next time, God bless you all.
They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes.
Here's the news, Dad.
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days.
Ditch the fake news and always get the truth. Go to thenewamerican.com.